On a silent winter night, when the forest lay frozen under the cold, a faint scratching echoed at the door of an old wooden cabin. Henry, an aging former army medic long used to solitude, never imagined the visitor would be a tiny bear cub, soaked, trembling, and desperate enough to look as though it might cry. It didn't attack, didn't flee. It simply met his gaze, pleading as if to say, "Please, save my mother." And in that fragile moment, a journey began that none of them could have ever expected. Henry Walsh woke to a sound so small it could have been a branch tapping the siding. The clock on the mantel said 3:07. Out beyond the single-pane window, the Sawtooth Range lay under a hard moon, the storm's last flurries still drifting like ash. He listened, holding his breath. There it was again, thin, careful, almost polite. A scratch at the door, then another, then a pause, as if whoever was out there was gathering the courage to try once more. He swung his legs from the cot, joints arguing the way old joints do, and pulled on the wool sweater with the loose elbow. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and last night's coffee. He took the flashlight, but he didn't turn it on. Habit. Out here, sudden light could startle anything with eyes. The third scratch came while his hand was on the latch, a frail sound that somehow reached the softest part of him. He lifted the bar, eased the door open, and let the cold pour in. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. A bear cub stood on the top step, small enough that its ears looked too large for its head. Wet, shaking, caked with snow and grit, it blinked up at Henry as if the effort itself hurt. He knew the usual script. Cubs alone were trouble, and trouble wore teeth. But the cub didn't huff or back away. It planted both forepaws on the threshold and made the smallest motion, a scrape and a drag, as if trying to pull him across the line between warm human room and brutal night. "Easy, kid," Henry said, and heard how soft he'd made his voice. His breath smoked in the doorway. "Where's your mother?" The cub glanced past him into the dim cabin, took in the stove, the cot, the hanging slicker, and then looked over its shoulder toward the black trees. It gave a sound so low, Henry felt it more than heard it. A pleading murmur, not a warning. The old soldier in him stood at attention. He had seen that look before on faces without fur. The startled, desperate intelligence that comes when fear has nowhere else to go. He stepped onto the porch, leaving the door half open. The cub swayed, then turned and trotted a few paces, stopped, looked back, lifted a paw, and pressed it into the snow like a child pointing the way. Its tracks were a dotted line across the clearing, already filling in with blown crystals. The wind carried smells Henry knew by heart. Sap torn from fresh breakage, the damp chalk of disturbed rock, the iron of cold water. Far off, a wolf called, not the bright yip of a scout, but the steady tone of a voice counting the darkness. The cub flinched, then fixed its eyes on Henry again. "All right," he said. "Show me." He ducked inside, grabbed the field kit from its nail, and shouldered into the canvas coat that remembered 100 other midnights. He checked the satchel by touch. Bandages, thermal blanket, glucose gel, tourniquet he'd rather not need, a compact headlamp, a foil packet of honey he kept for rare mornings when coffee wasn't enough. He slipped the honey into a pocket he could reach without looking. He shut the stove's draft, pulled the door to with a click, and followed the cub into the timber. The storm had chewed the forest, but not swallowed it. Branches lay like broken bones under the firs, and the path, if you could call it that, was a chain of moments, a place where snow sagged, the shine of ice in a boot print, the shadowed ribs of a fallen snag. The cub kept to the edge of Henry's light, moving with a courage that didn't quite match its size. Twice it stopped to listen, nose high, whiskers trembling. Twice Henry heard the soft slide of snow settling somewhere above them. A ridge. A runout. Rock exposed and then hurriedly buried again. He pictured the country the way he always did, in cross-sections and arrows, what held, what could give, what would take you with it if it went. They crossed the dry bed of a summer creek, its stones frosted to white coins. The cub slipped and recovered, stubborn in the way of the very young and very afraid. When Henry's beam found a splash of dark on the snow, a smear of dirt and a few coarse hairs, he knelt. Bear sign, fresh. He scanned the slope and saw where the trees had been scoured clean. A raw slide the width of a truck and the length of a prayer. The cub stood over him as if guarding the discovery, patience radiating from its small body like heat. "You did good," he told it, and the words surprised him with their tenderness. They climbed the apron of the slide, boots creaking, snow complaining under weight. The moon slid behind a ridge, and the world flattened to black and silver. The cub pressed on, cresting a lip and vanishing from his light. Henry hurried, lungs taking in air so cold it burned, and came over the rise into a shallow bowl where the wind had died and left the night to its own silence. He knew the shape before his mind gave it a name. A broad form, half buried against a boulder, breath drawing once and then disappearing, drawing again like someone trying to remember how. The cub went straight to her and laid its head along the line of her jaw. The bear's fur was packed with ice around the shoulder and hip, and the snow immediately surrounding her was pitted where small paws had worried at it. Claw marks raked in straight lines. Frantic. Useless. Henry kept his distance because the rules said he should, and then he broke the rules because something older said he must. He set down the kit, eased his gloved fingers into the fur at her neck, felt for what he needed to feel. The pulse was there, a thin thread tugging at his glove seam. The breath was there too, shallow and inconsistent, with a hitch that made his own chest tighten in sympathy. He swept the beam across the scene. The boulder had rolled from higher up, the scrape marks gouged into the crust like handwriting. It pinned the bear at an angle that would rob a limb of blood and a mind of will. Around the perimeter, wolf tracks stitched a careful circle, never crossing the smell line of a creature not yet surrendered. Henry spoke aloud, knowing the cub wouldn't understand the words, but might understand the calm. "She's alive. She held on." He told himself the same thing, felt the old muscles remember their purpose, felt the stubbornness he carried like a birthmark settle in. He folded the thermal blanket and slid it beneath the bear's exposed side to leach away some of the cold. The cub made room, lifting its face, eyes glossy and hot. It gave another of those low sounds, the kind that find the cracks in a man and widen them without asking. "Stay with her," he said. "I'm going to get help." He stepped away just enough to raise the radio from the side pocket and thumb it on. Static rushed like the sea in a shell, then steadied. He gave his name, his grid, the situation in clipped sentences that fit between breaths. A voice came back, the night dispatcher he knew only as a last name and a patience, and said someone would route the call to Emily Brooks at the ranger station. He closed the loop, said he'd mark the trail where the slide began, said he would keep them warm as best he could. The cub pressed closer to its mother, so close Henry had to slide his hands beneath both of them to wedge the blanket further. The bear's ear twitched once, a flicker of life insisting on itself. The wind rose, dragged a handful of dry snow across the bowl, and lay down again. Far off, the wolves spoke to one another in long, level voices, counting distance, measuring risk. Henry sat back on his heels, the cold seeping through the knees of his pants, the weight of the night finding its place on his shoulders. He looked at the cub and saw not an orphan in waiting, but a sentinel, small and refusing. He looked at the mother and saw a will so stubborn it had outlasted rock. He looked at his hands and saw what they had been made to do and what they would have to do next when help arrived. "Hold on," he said, and the words seemed to belong to all three of them. "Hold on, and we'll get you out of this." The cub blinked, and in that brief, shimmering silence the forest itself seemed to lean closer, listening. Emily Brooks reached Henry's marker tape in under 20 minutes, headlights doused at the last bend so she wouldn't spook whatever waited beyond. She was young, sharp-eyed, a wool cap pulled down over hair that never quite stayed put, and she moved, with the quick competence of someone who'd learned the woods by walking them. Henry met her where the trees opened to the scar of the slide. The cub stood between them and the bowl like a sentry, small chest heaving, paws lifted, and set in silent urgency. "You weren't kidding," Emily said softly. "Any change?" "She's alive," Henry answered. "Cold, pinned, breathing like a bellows with a broken rib. Wolves have been circling but keeping a respectful distance." Emily crouched, hands open where the cub could see them. "Hey, little one," she murmured. "We're going to try to be the good kind of trouble, okay?" The cub watched her for a long beat, then looked past both of them toward the hollow where its mother lay. A crunch of boots came from the dark, and a man stepped into the wash of Emily's headlamp. He lifted his free hand to shade his eyes. "Don't shoot. I'm friend-shaped," he said, a little breathless. He wore a down jacket patched with gaffer's tape and carried a camera that looked like it could take a fall and keep shooting. "Name's Caleb Hart. I've been on the East Ridge photographing elk. Heard your radio on a scanner and figured you might want another set of hands." Emily's chin tipped up. "You're not supposed to be on that frequency?" "I'm not supposed to be a lot of places," Caleb said without heat. "But I've got a decent back and a decent conscience." He glanced at the cub. "And I'm guessing you need both." Henry weighed the man in a heartbeat, the way old habits teach. The jacket said field, the boots said miles, the eyes said he'd stay if asked and leave if told. "If you're steady, stay." "I'm steady," Caleb said simply. They moved together along the edge, boots finding purchase where the wind had scoured down to crust. Emily parsed the terrain with a ranger's eye, where to stand, where not to, how far the slide had run, where it wanted to run again if given an excuse. At the lip, she held up a hand and they stopped. The bowl lay below like a held breath. The bear's dark form didn't seem to have shifted at all. The cub went down first, then Henry, then Emily and Caleb, careful with every footfall. Up close, Maple looked even larger, reduced by the angle and not by her size. Ice crusted the fur at the hip where stone met flesh. Henry slid 2 fingers back to the pulse point and felt it again, that string-thin insistence. Emily lowered her pack and spoke in the same voice she'd use at a roadside rollover. "We'll need a lever and a pivot. I've got 10 meters of static line, 2 carabiners, a webbing loop. There's a dead limber pine upslope we can crib with. Caleb, can you fetch me that bleached trunk about 6 feet long?" Caleb was already moving. "On it." The cub pressed its head against Maple's cheek and made the small sound that had pulled Henry from sleep. The wolves sang once, low, orderly, a sound with its own distance, and went quiet again. Emily cut a trench with her boot to clear space for the lever, then took the webbing and slung it around the boulder's shoulder. "We're not lifting this thing," she said. "We're persuading it to be somewhere else." Caleb dragged the trunk into place, breath fogging in the cold. "I've also got a camera trap up the ridge," he said between pulls. "Or had one. The storm tried to eat it. If it's still there, it might show what happened." "After," Emily said, and set the lever. They worked the way people work when failure is not allowed. Emily steadied the base, legs braced, jaw set. Henry bore down on the far end, old shoulders straining, the world narrowing to the give of wood and the groan of rock. Caleb slid blocks of snow and bark into the gaps as the stone inched, anything to keep it from rolling back. The first motion was so small Henry might have imagined it, except the cub felt it too and lifted its head as if hope had weight. "Again," Emily said. They tried, and the lever slipped, pinching Henry's glove hard enough to make him see sparks. Caleb lunged to wedge the trunk back under. Snow from the rim whispered down like sifted flour and settled against Henry's collar. He thought of hospital wards and nights that didn't end, and told his hands to keep going. On the 4th try, the boulder rolled a hand's width and held. Emily slid the loop higher and reset. "One more," she said, breath puffing in small white ghosts. "Gentle. Let it do the work." They put their backs to it, and the rock gave as if remembering something it wanted. The pressure on Maple's hip eased. Henry and Caleb pulled together on the count Emily gave, and Maple slid free into the pocket Henry had cleared with the thermal. The sudden release toppled Henry to a knee. Caleb caught his elbow. Emily yanked the lever away before the boulder could snap back and crush a foot. For one heartbeat, everything was only quiet. Then Maple's breath stuttered and stopped. Henry didn't think. He was already at her head, clearing the packed snow from mouth and nose, feeling for airway with the careful respect owed to teeth that could end him even in panic. Emily's hand went to his shoulder. "Henry?" "She's not done," he said. The cub made a sound like grief trying to be brave. It pressed its body into Maple's, nose to her muzzle, as if its own breath could substitute. Henry stripped his glove with his teeth, set heel of hand just caudal to the sternum where bare anatomy rhymed with his training, and began compressions in a slow, deliberate cadence meant for big chests and cold muscles. Caleb's eyes shone wet in the headlamp's halo. Emily knelt to keep the airway open, her fingers steady, though a tremor ran through her forearm. "Come on," Henry said, count soft but relentless. "You've already done the hard part. Come on." Caleb glanced uphill, then down to his camera. "If I can find that trap, I might be able to tell how long she's been like this," he said, as if facts themselves could hold a line against fear. He scrambled up the short wall of the bowl and vanished over the lip. Henry kept time with the oldest metronome there is: hope. The world roared down to the push and the release, the push and the release. Under his hand, something like resistance gathered, a far rain moving closer. He pressed again, and Maple's ribs shivered, not a true breath, but the memory of one. Emily bent her head so close her cap brushed Henry's wrist. "That's it," she whispered. "Take it." Caleb slid back into the bowl with a cracked casing and a mud-scratched SD card held like a relic between two fingers. "The camera's toast, but the card might have survived," he said, voice hushed as a church. "After we stabilize her, I'll check it." "After we stabilize her," Henry agreed and pressed again. Somewhere beneath his hands, a spark found a thread and followed it home. Maple's chest lifted on its own, shallow, uncertain. The cub jerked as if pulled by a string and nosed frantically along its mother's muzzle. Henry took his weight off, ready to go back if the rhythm faltered. Emily's eyes closed for a second, as if the prayer she hadn't spoken could now be allowed to end. "Breathing," she said, a statement, not a question. "Breathing," Henry echoed, his voice rough with cold and relief. He slid the thermal tighter, tucked the edges around fur and small shoulders alike, and looked up the slope where the dark held its counsel and waited for what came next. Wolves did not speak again. The wind did not rise. The night, for the first time since Henry had opened his door, seemed willing to let them work in peace. The night deepened around them, settling into a cold so steady it felt almost personal. Maple's breaths were faint but present, wisps rising like thin smoke in the headlamp glow. Emily radioed the station to update their status, speaking low, controlled, the way she did when her nerves were working harder than her words. Henry tucked the blanket snug around Maple's ribs, watching the slow lift of her flank with the wary hope of a man who has seen life leave the body too many times to trust it when it lingers. "We got her breathing," Emily said as she clipped the radio back to her vest. "But we're not out of the woods, literally or otherwise. The others are at least 40 minutes out. Temperatures are dropping fast." Henry nodded. "We need to keep her warm and still. If she slides into shock again—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The cub pressed closer to Maple, trembling, its tiny breaths sinking to hers like a vow. Caleb knelt with the battered SD card cupped in his palm. I checked what I could on my backup viewer. The last recording hit right before the storm knocked the trap loose. Looked like she was shielding the cub when the shelf gave way. She put herself between it and the falling rocks. His voice thinned. That mother fought the mountain for her kid. Emily exhaled into the cold. Some mothers do. The wolves called again, farther now, but still close enough to remind them that the world didn't pause just because one life needed it to. Henry scanned the ridge, counting shadows, angles, distances. We can't wait for the team to haul her out. This bowl is a dead end if they get curious. We move her before the wind shifts and our scent blows wide. Move her how? Caleb asked. Henry pointed to a stand of young fir at the bowl's lower edge. We build a drag sled, branches, jackets, anything that can distribute her weight enough to slide her down to the ravine trail. It's narrow but packed, and the rescue crew can reach it with their transport. Emily assessed the slope with a ranger's practiced eye, then nodded. If we angle it right, gravity will help instead of betray us. She looked at Caleb. You with us? Wouldn't dream of leaving, he said, shrugging out of his jacket. Just don't judge me if I cry again. This night's got sharp elbows. They worked quickly. Caleb dragged down 2 fir limbs wide enough to bear Maple's weight. Emily tied cross-lashing with her static line, looping it tight, checking every knot twice. Henry patted the sled with both his and Caleb's jackets, the fabric stiffening as the cold took it. The cub watched everything with wide, liquid eyes, pacing in small, anxious arcs, occasionally touching Maple's muzzle, as if reminding her that the world had not gone entirely dark. When the sled was ready, Henry slid his hands beneath Maple's shoulders. Easy now, he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for her or for himself. Her fur was cold, thick, unmoving beneath the weight of exhaustion. Caleb lifted at the haunches, Emily guiding them into the cradle of branches. Maple groaned faintly as her weight shifted, and the cub darted close, nose pressed to her cheek until it was sure she still breathed. Okay, Emily said. We haul, slow and steady. The first drag took them only a few feet. Snow packed under the runners, catching in clumps, forcing Henry to stop and clear the worst of it. Their breaths came hard and loud, fogging the air. The wolves had fallen silent, which Henry found more unsettling than their calls. Silence meant they were listening. At the bowl's lip, the trouble began. The snow here was loose, the slope deceptive, the earth beneath waiting for a mistake. As Henry tightened his grip on the pull rope, his boot found nothing but sudden air. The edge gave way under him in a crumble of ice and sand. He pitched forward, catching himself on his forearm just as Emily seized the back of his coat. Don't move, she said sharply. I wasn't planning on sprinting, Henry muttered, teeth set. Caleb anchored himself against a fir trunk and tossed the tail end of the wood, static line toward Henry. Grab it! I've got you! Henry caught the line, fingers numb but determined. The sled had begun to slide, Maple's weight pulling it toward the drop. The cub, frantic, clambered onto the sled, trying to push against its mother's body. Its tiny claws raked the jacket fabric, slipping. Get the cub off, Emily called. If the sled goes, it'll take him too. Henry braced his boots against what remained of the ledge and hauled on the rope, grunting as pain shot up his hip. Emily scrambled to the sled, scooping the cub in one practiced motion and tucking it under her arm like a child clinging to a life raft. Caleb pulled from above, shoulders bowing with the strain, and bit by bit the sled inched back to flat ground. When the last of Henry's weight shifted onto solid snow again, all three froze, listening, as if the mountain might judge their efforts. Then Henry gave a thin laugh, the kind a man gives when he reaches a door he was sure led nowhere. Well, he said, that woke me up. Emily's face was pale but steady. We adjust our angle, no shortcuts. With a new path chosen, they tried again, steering the sled along the gentler inside curve of the slope. It was slow going, a deliberate pilgrimage of inches. Each slide forward felt like a victory, each pause like a prayer. The cub trotted beside them, small paws sinking into each print they left, as though to remind them this journey was its own. At last they reached the ravine trail, narrow but firm-packed where wind had swept it clean. Henry took the lead rope, Emily steadied the rear, and Caleb flanked with the cub, who insisted on walking so close he nearly stepped on Caleb's boots. "We'll make the turn out by the river bend," Emily said. "Crew can reach us there." Henry felt Maple's breath against the back of his glove, faint and struggling. "Hold on," he said softly. "We've got ground now." They moved along the ravine in careful rhythm, the dark walls rising on either side like sleeping giants. Snow sifted down from unseen shelves high above. Somewhere ahead, the river murmured under thick ice, a sound of motion steady enough to steady a heart. Then, Maple's body shifted. Her flank expanded, not a breath, but something between a tremor and a sigh. The cub froze, turned to her, and made a tiny, hopeful sound. Henry bent to look. Maple's eyes, glazed but aware, fluttered open for a moment before sliding closed again. "She's fighting," Henry said, emotion tightening his throat. "She's really fighting." Emily's voice softened. "Good girl. Just a little farther." They pushed on, the night opening slightly as if welcoming their persistence. Lights flickered in the distance, headlamps from the rescue crew winding down the switchbacks. Caleb looked up, relief breaking across his features. "They're coming. We made it." Henry didn't answer right away. He was watching Maple, watching the cub, watching the trail ahead that seemed, for the first time that night, to be leading them somewhere that wasn't loss. Only when the first rescuer's shout echoed off the ravine walls did he speak. "Let's bring her home," he said, and they hauled the sled forward into the waiting lights, the cub running beside them as if the night had finally given back what it tried to take. The rescue crew reached them in a scatter of white beams cutting through the dark, their breath hanging thick in the bitter air. Maple lay still on the sled, but no longer as cold, her breaths steadier, the tremors of returning strength faint beneath her fur. The cub clung to her side until one of the rescuers approached, then pressed even closer, as if to make itself part of her warmth. Emily stepped forward, her voice low but firm, as she briefed the medics on everything they had done, every breath Maple had taken, and the rock that nearly ended her life. Henry kept a hand on the sled rope, as though letting go might undo the last hours. Caleb, exhausted and glassy-eyed, wiped frost from his camera viewer while the crew prepared a reinforced transport harness. One of the medics, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, sank to a knee beside Maple and listened to her chest. "She's hanging in there," he said, and Henry felt something settle in his bones, something like belief. They lifted Maple and secured her carefully, the harness built to cradle her weight without strain. The cub whined, pacing in frantic half-circles until Emily scooped it close again and tucked it into her coat. "You're coming too, little one," she whispered, and the cub pressed its face into the wool, as if accepting the promise without question. The trek to the transport sled went quicker than the journey down the ravine. Snow had begun to drift heavier, each flake a slow-turning spark in the lantern light. The mountains loomed around them, not unfriendly now, just vast, as if recognizing the quiet stubbornness of the humans moving through their winter heart. At the trailhead, Maple was transferred into a heated rescue crate lined with blankets and thermal pads. The cub was placed inside a smaller adjoining compartment where it could see its mother through a mesh divider. The moment they latched the doors, the cub lifted a paw to the mesh, tapping it once. Maple, though barely awake, turned her head, as if answering. Henry stood back, letting the crew work. His gloves were stiff with frozen sweat. His shoulders ached from the strain of the haul, but he felt neither cold nor tired now, only a solemn, fragile satisfaction, like standing at the end of a long vigil and watching dawn decide to show itself after all. Emily walked to his side. "You did more than most men would have even tried," she said. Henry shook his head. "Most men would have done the same if a cub showed up at their door asking for help." Emily smiled, but there was a quiet understanding in her expression. I don't think that's true. Not everyone listens when the wilderness speaks. Behind them, Caleb finally got the cracked SD card to load on his backup viewer. The screen flickered and jittered, but the final clip played. Maple pushing the cub aside with her body as the first stones tumbled from above. She'd placed herself between the cub and the storm without hesitation. Caleb swallowed hard. She saved him before she ever needed saving herself. Henry watched the frozen image, a mother bracing against a force she couldn't outrun, and felt the weight of that truth slide into place. He did the same tonight, came all the way to my door. He let out a breath that almost became a laugh. Brave little soul. The rescue convoy started down the forest road, engines rumbling low, headlights glazing the trees in passing gold. Henry rode in the back beside the crate, the cub's soft cries threading through the dark. Maple stirred once, lifting her head enough that her nose brushed the mesh where the cub waited. It was all the reassurance either of them needed. Whitehorse Forest Veterinary Center glowed warm against the winter shadows when they arrived. Inside, the staff moved quickly, guiding Maple onto a padded platform, linking monitors, wrapping warm packs around her limbs. The cub paced in its temporary pen, restless and vocal, until the staff decided to place the pen beside its mother's stall so it could see her. That alone seemed to calm its tiny heart. Hours passed in the soft hum of machines and whispered assessments. The storm outside thickened to a steady curtain of snow, hiding the mountains behind a veil of white. Henry sat in a chair by the wall, boots thawing into muddy puddles on the mat. Emily and Caleb drifted in and out of the room, checking updates, making calls, offering small words that dissolved into the steady work of waiting. Near dawn, Maple's breathing evened. Her eyes fluttered, then opened fully for the first time. The cub, curled tightly in its pen, startled awake, pressed its paws to the mesh, and made a trembling sound that struck every heart in the room. Maple turned her head toward the noise, slow but purposeful, and exhaled a warm, huffing sigh. "She's aware," one of the vets whispered. "She knows he's here." They opened the pen long enough to let the cub climb onto the padded platform. It went straight to Maple's neck, nuzzling into the thick fur there, trembling with relief. Maple shifted her paw, heavy and tentative, but unmistakably protective. No one in the room spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. 2 days later, Maple could stand. Not long, and not without help, but upright all the same. Her eyes were clearer, her movements more certain. The cub shadowed her every step, matching her pace with the seriousness of a young creature suddenly aware of the fragility of the world. The morning of their release arrived bright and crisp, the storm long spent, the forest wearing a fresh coat of snow. Henry met Emily and Caleb at the edge of the preserve, where the team had brought Maple and her cub for release. The rescue crate sat open, the air filled with pine and sunlight and the faint call of distant birds. The cub emerged first, stepping carefully into the snow, sniffing the wind as if reading a message written only for him. Maple followed, moving slower, but with a confidence that had returned like a memory rediscovered. They walked a few feet into the clearing before the cub turned back and chirped at his mother, urging her forward. But Maple paused. She looked over her shoulder, back at Henry. Her breath steamed into the cold. Her eyes, dark and steady, held a depth he couldn't quite describe. Fear overcome, debt acknowledged, a gratitude that belonged to the quiet places where language does not reach. It lasted only a moment, but it reached him deeper than any thank you ever could. Then she turned, nudged the cub ahead, and together they slipped between the trees, swallowed by the forest that had both tested and spared them. Emily came to stand beside Henry, hands in her pockets. "Not every story out here ends like that," she said gently. "No," Henry answered, "but this one did." He lifted his face to the cold air, listening to the quiet settling in the pines, the faint crackle of snow softening under the morning sun. And I'll take that. Caleb snapped one last photo of the empty clearing, snow sparkling where the bear's footprints led into the timber. For the record, he said, I think the wilderness chose correctly when it knocked on your door. Henry didn't reply, but a small smile crept into the lines of his weathered face. The day stretched before them, bright and open, the forest returned to its calm. And somewhere in that stillness, a mother bear and her cub walked on, alive because a frightened little creature had asked for help. And a man had listened. Some moments stay. Some looks remain. And some nights, the kind that begin with a scratch at the door, carve themselves into a life so deeply that nothing that follows is ever quite the same. If this story touched your heart even a little, would you leave a simple comment for us? You don't need to write much. Just type 1 to send your love to this brave little cub, or 0 if you're wishing strength for the mother bear. Your comment truly helps more people find these stories. And if you'd like to join us for the next heartfelt wildlife tale, please consider subscribing. There are many more extraordinary moments of courage, kindness, and unexpected miracles waiting for you here.